So this is my first draft of our vaccines linked to autism. We're going to start with the introduction of the conflict. The conflict is between institutional scientists, namely the CDC and the World Health Organization, and skeptics. The big one, of course, RFK Jr., but also alternative practitioners in general. Institutionally, the claim comes from data, clinical studies, and consensus, and they're usually given authority as government-sponsored figures, but also in the processes of peer review, reproducibility, and global collaboration. The skeptics' claims are usually that institutions are inherently not trustworthy and that they're hiding something from us to keep us down. The institutions are the elites, whereas we are the normal people. We're then going to move on to the historical gaps, the source of mistrust in the institutions that tell us, vaccines are good for us. The big one I'm going to be focusing on is the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which it was covered up. A lot of people died, a lot of people were experimented on, and it wasn't until a lot later that the full details, full details came out. And this is a pretty repeated pattern of the government trying to cover up its misfires, which, of course, if you mess up, you don't want to tell people, but at this scale, it's going to sow doubt in the minds of the people outside of the institution. Let's see. Yeah, so the result of the Tuskegee syphilis study, as well as many other historical gaps, is that there's going to be long-term skepticism towards government-sponsored medicine. Now, it keeps growing bigger because we're gonna get focused on vaccines in particular. But in 1998, there was a paper published that officially put out the claim that there is a link to neurodivergency and vaccines. This was published in a scientific paper, so it wasn't the most accessible to regular people, but it still did put the scientific claim out there into the scientific world. It's not until 2005 when RFK Jr. published in the Rolling Stones a more publicly accessible scientific informational source of a link between autism and vaccines, and in big part due to the mercury in vaccines. These claims were made even easier due to social media coming up, Facebook, Twitter, and nowadays it's really a lot of Twitter, a lot of Reddit, and a lot of Instagram and Facebook still. It's really easy to do so because social media is already designed to be an echo chamber. They're inherently meant to keep you hooked in. They're meant to, show you what you want to see, keep you engaged. The common theme with the skeptics who claim that there's a link between autism and vaccines is that the usual claims are supported through emotionally driven testimony, anecdotal evidence, and the hidden documents that the government is withholding from its citizens that create a sense of rebellion against the government. You're rebelling against the elites trying to keep you down. It makes you feel better as an individual, and it feels like you have you're working towards a cause. The CDC and the World Health Organization are, of course, going to counter with fact checks. They're going to counter with their own research. They're going to counteract with, proven information. But inherently, it's not going to be the most convincing because they are still the institutional medicine body that, as a skeptic, you were trying to rebel against. Here is where we're going to have our first interview. I have a researcher who works to produce and approve vaccines, and we're going to discuss, as the guy who has to put out the claim that a vaccine is safe and has to prove that it's safe, we're going to ask what kind of weight is there, what kind of research goes into it, and how easy is it to fudge your data, massage around it, because this 1998 study was eventually retracted due to people finding holes in it. It was a very, very small sample size, the data was misleading, and it created a pretty massive landslide afterwards. We're going to follow that with the expansion into a more political scene, because especially in 2025, the anti-vax movement is very much tied to the current political regime. And at a certain point, it becomes not about the vaccines, right? It's not just about vaccines causing autism, it's about personal agency. It's the responsibility to the public, to society, to be vaccinated, to be protected against disease that nobody else gets sick, versus the individual freedom to say, hey, I don't want to risk autism, I'm not going to take the vaccine. The institutional information really gets merged with government authority because it's government sponsored, of course, but the skeptical information often aligns with more populist values, in particular of defiance against the elites. And we're going to close off with our reflection. We're mostly talking about how it began as government mistrust. It began as trying to find this link that the government is hiding from us. But ultimately, it's a big picture of who gets to decide science, who gets to decide that truth, and who gets to decide on your own bodily autonomy. The institutions are, of course, going to be built on experience. They're going to be the ones telling you, like, you got to do this for common good. Whereas the skeptics are really built on emotion and built on the idea of personal authority. And we're going to have a second interview in this section with one of my friends who is actually diagnosed on the autism spectrum disorder. We're going to ask about mostly the stigma around autism. In particular, questions like, do you think the societal stigma against autism inherently gives more legs to the stance that even though even though the risk of the link between autism and vaccines isn't worth taking. We're going to talk a lot about societally why autism as the center of the debate pushes it so much further. Thanks for all your feedback.